Hello. I hope everyone is gesund, stark und freilich, healthy, strong, and happy. Begashmis v'ruchnis. The Eibusher should help that all those Yidden that need a Yeshua in Bonei Chayim Mezoni should be helped straight away. As usual, we'll start the thought of the week with a pasuk from the Rebbe's new kapitel Kuf Yutes, and today we are going to focus on pasuk Kuf Samach Gimel. Shekes Onesi v'asa Evo Teiroscha Ohavti. I hate falsehood and I abhor it. Your Torah I have loved. So what we see from this pasuk is the idea of a contrast. In Judaism, we have absolutes, as we've spoken about before. There's anochi v'lo yilcha. There's clarity. We say the first mitzvah in the Torah is the mitzvah say of anochi Hashem alikecha, to believe in God, and then there's also lo yilcha likim acherim, and you're not allowed to have any idols or worship any idols, no other gods. So there's the positive and there's the negative. There's the do's and the don'ts. There's good and there's evil. There's a contrast. We know how we're supposed to act, and we know what we're not meant to do. And the pasuk says over here, Sheker Sonesi, I hate falsehood, and Teiroscha Hofti, I love Torah. So we see the contrast, which brings us to this week's parsha, a very, very famous episode. This week's parsha is Parshas Matos. Masei, in Parshas Matos, it speaks about the war with the Midyanites. And the pasuk says that Hashem spoke to Moshe and said, Nikoim nikmas bnei Yisrael me'esa Midyanim, take retribution for the children of Israel from the Midyanites. Acha te'osef elamecha, and then Moshe will pass away. And then it says, Vayidaba Moshe Elohim, Leimar hecholzu mitchem anoshim l'tzava, arm men from among yourselves for the army, that they may be against the Yu al Midyan, loses nikmas Hashem ben Midyan. So it speaks about the war that Israel, Bnei Yisrael, will wage against Midyan. And there's a very, very famous discourse of the 5th Lubavitcher Rebbe, the Rebbe Rashab, in the year 1898, Tafresh Nun Tes. He said a Hasidic discourse starting with the words Echolzu. And the Rebbe made a very big emphasis about this discourse and other of the Rabbeim. And this discourse speaks about the concept of Midyan and what it means in our lives today, which, as we've spoken about many times, Chassidus shows us how, even though there are many mitzvahs today or concepts that don't exist in a physical realm, like, for example, the mitzvah to wage war with Amalek, but nevertheless, there's an inner Amalek, there's an inner Midyan, there's a spiritual idea in our service of Hashem, which applies to this very day and has great relevance. So, in the discourses, the Hasidic discourses about Midyan, there's the famous questions, and we'll have to be very brief. These are very long discourses, that when Hashem speaks to Moshe Rabbeinu about it, he says, Nikoim nikmas b'nei Yisrael, take retribution for the nation, for the Jews. And then when Moshe speaks about it to the Yidden, to the Jews, he says, Loses nikmas Hashem ben Midyan, we're taking retribution for Hashem. So is it retribution for what they did to the Yidden, or is it retribution for Hashem? And Rashi says over here, the famous point that whoever starts with Israel is as if he fights against Hashem, so it's really the same thing. But Chassidus adds to that. Another question over here is about why does it seem that right after this campaign, this war, then Moshe Rabbeinu passes on, which seems to imply that this is like the culmination of Moshe's life. So to make a long story short, this is the contrast. Midyan represents pure ego, a monumental ego, an ego without any bounds. In other words, selfishness. And then we have the opposite, selflessness. So therefore, whether we're talking about the name of Yud Kei Vav Kei, Hashem is Hashem Echad, God holiness, Jews, Torah, all represent oneness and something united. Klippa, evil, represents division and disunity. So therefore, this Midyan is like the polar opposite. The essence, so to speak, of evil is selfishness and ego. And they represent the polar opposite, the contrast to holiness. And therefore it's Nikmas Hashem. Because what is like the headquarters, the central headquarters of evil is selfishness. So therefore this stands in stark contrast to Shem Havaya. That's why Shem Havaya, they can't coexist in the same planet. You can't have, as the Pasuk says, falsehood and truth. You can't have that there should be an entity of absolute total ego and selfishness, and at the same time selflessness. And this is also the answer why Moshe Rabbeinu has to lead this campaign, and then once he finishes this campaign, then he could pass on, because this is like a crowning achievement. After his entire career and all the great things that he accomplished, he still has to go into the central headquarters of the evil of selfishness and conquer it and eradicate it. And then he can go on to the next level. So basically, in our service of Hashem, the discourses of Echolzu all speak about Ahavas Yisrael, loving a fellow person. So, and those discourses discuss how each and every one of us might have an element of Midyan in a subtle way. In other words, ego, which causes us to have difficulties in getting along with another person. And that's what's discussed in those Maimorim of Chassidus, that the reason why there's discord and the obstacle to true Ahavas Yisrael is my ego. My ego doesn't give room for the other person. And therefore I see the other person as a threat to me. But if I was selfless, the more selfless I am, the more I can give room for another person. And that's the idea. And these are the 3 weeks. We're in the 3 weeks now. With the 3 weeks, we say that the destruction of the temple came about because of baseless hatred, sinas chinam. So therefore, what's most important is to speak about avas chinam. Every single one of us has to go on an ego diet and try to think about ways how we could become more selfless. There's 2 anecdotes, stories that I would like to mention, which are mind-boggling, especially the first one. The Mezritcher Maggid said about the Baal Shem Tov, who, as we all know, the Baal Shem Tov was kol kulay, totally about Ahavas Yisrael. That's what he was all about. That's all he thought about. That's all he cared about. That's all he spoke about. Ahavas Yisrael. The Mezritcher Maggid, his prized and most highest disciple, said about the Baal Shem Tov the following. Ob the Baal Shem Tov wohl sein dich bei allem Midyan gewusst, wie viel tut mit sein Kiruv zu Yidden. If the Baal Shem Tov would have known on this world how much he accomplishes through reaching out to other Jews, as he knows it now, as he's in a Shama on high in Gan Eden, it would have been totally in another realm, in another level. So this is absolutely astounding. The Baal Shem Tov, who we cannot beat the Baal Shem Tov when it comes to his level of Ahavas Yisrael. It's the greatest. And nevertheless, the Mezritcher Maggid says about the Baal Shem Tov, that if the Baal Shem Tov would know now how awesome and how amazing the idea of Ahavas Yisrael is, to embrace and reach out to another Jew in a way of affection and closeness, he would have done it on a completely higher realm, in a higher way. It's unbelievable. Now I want to tell you about a chassid. His name was Reb Hendel, to give you a picture of what's the Hasidic way of life permeated with Ahavas Yisrael. I'm going to read to you from what the Friedrich Rebbe writes about this chassid in Sefer HaSichos Tafshin Beis, page 99. And he says, the Ahavas Yisrael of Reb Hendel is gone to Mitzvah, and we can't even imagine it. He would literally give of himself totally for every Jew. when Reb Shmuel Zalmanov is given krank, there was another chassid, a friend of his, who became sick. Und gedarft haben frische Milch, and he needed fresh milk. Vielleicht den Aufstehen Fahrtag, so Reb Hendel got up every day pre-dawn, und gehen allein am Mahalach Rav zu können kriegen die Milch in a kleinem Teppele. So there was Reb Hendel walking for a long way with a pot to go get fresh milk, just milk from the cows, for his friend who was sick. Und kommen de kaheim allein das abkochen, and then he would prepare it, turn on the fire, and prepare it to give it to his friend. Und das ist gewesen kol chayusei. And that was his whole life. His whole spirit was involved in doing such a favor for another person. Then es ist gewesen amol a Sreife in Lubavitch. There was once a fire in Lubavitch. Is gestanden in Drößen und geweint mit Moish Sholos. He watched the fire and he sobbed profusely. Idische Geld brennt. Jewish money is burning. It's going up in smoke. Jewish possessions. Jewish property. Beisman hat zugenommen sein Sohn von ihm. He had an only son, and that son passed away in his lifetime. Hat es mekabel gewesen bis Simcha und gesagt, mit dem seiner sie. He received it joyously, he accepted it, and he said, probably that's the way it has to be. No beisa Sreife hat geweint, was idische Geld brennt. But when he saw another Jew suffering a monetary loss, he sobbed. He took it so much to heart. As krank geworden b'machle kwede, he became very sick. Und von dem Machle ist niftig geworden. And from this disease, he passed away. Man hat dann Tekev gerufen, 2 große Doktoren von Vitebsk, aber es hat nicht geholfen. They called 2 doctors from a big city, it didn't help. So this is the type of Ahavas Yisrael that our Abbeim demanded from us. It was all heart, to really, really love your fellow Jew. When the Rebbe gave out this kuntras, this mimer that the Rebbe Rashab said in 1898, the Rebbe gave it out, he distributed it 32 years ago in 1988. And this was the only time when he distributed a discourse that he said to each person that he gave it to, הצלחהדיקן learning, which means a successful learning, a successful studying. So the Rebbe gave the Maimer to every one of us, and he told us, learning. I'm not going through some ritual here where I'm just giving you this. I want you to study it, and the studying should be successful. And what does it mean, learning? That it actually becomes applied into action. The Eibusha should help, that we should all improve our Ahavas Yisrael, which this will immediately nullify the gullus that we're in now, and bring Mashiach Tzidkenu, take it from Miyad, Mamish. Posting from my home, Be'ez Hashem Yisbarach, your man in Melbourne.